1990's Predator 2, directed by Stephen Hopkins and starring Danny Glover, is the follow-up to the much-revered Predator from 1987. It was written by Jim and John Thomas, who returned after writing the original. Set in the year 1997, 10 years after the events of the first film, Predator 2 takes place on the streets of a degenerated and heavily polluted Los Angeles during a record heatwave and violent conflict between the Columbian and Jamaican gangs trying to take over, with the city's police force caught in the middle. The story follows main character Detective-Lieutenant Mike Harrigan, played by Glover, as his investigation of the gang war leads him to cross paths with a predator who's been drawn to the city by the heat and violence, also attracting the attention of a covert federal agency attempting to capture the creature. Having such big shoes to fill, coming after the legendary Predator 1, I think is what kind of magnified the bad rap Predator 2 carried for quite a while after release. I remember the first time I saw it was around 2005 when I bought the DVD. After first viewing, I had a pretty lukewarm reaction to it myself, which was also the general consensus if you'd asked most fans around that time. But then as the years went on, and after we'd gotten a few more films, I began to slowly notice online how more and more people seemed to be coming out and saying that they in fact really liked Predator 2, calling it underrated and the best Predator sequel. After giving it another chance myself, I actually enjoyed it a bit more than I had before. I think this could be in part down to how your tastes change over time, but I theorise the main reason why so many people seem to like it a lot more now than they did back in the day is down to two factors. Firstly is how back when most people hated Predator 2, it seemed to be back when the only Predator movies we had were Predator and Predator 2, and then later Predator 1, 2 and the AVP films around that time, between the release of Predator 2 and before we would later get Predators in 2010 and The Predator in 2018. I think that's because at the time we only had two dedicated Predator movies, the classic Predator 1 and the not as good sequel Predator 2, so naturally, since the second wasn't in the same league as the first, people thought of it as being just the disappointing sequel. But then further down the line, when we got a couple more films that people liked even less, which I guess you could say essentially recalibrated where Predator 2 stood in a lot of people's heads. Which gets me to the second factor, being how, as a lot of people who were around in the 80s and 90s would probably agree with, is how the quality of storytelling in cinema has declined a long way from where it once was. It would seem a lot of movies that didn't stand in very high regard back in the day, when compared with today's endless supply of remakes, reboots and cape shit, all of a sudden those older quote-unquote bad films don't feel so bad anymore. Basically what I'm getting at is that I believe it was because there were only two actual Predator films to compare to one another at the time, and because films nowadays have become so poor on the whole over the last 15 years or so that they actually make older bad movies look decent now. But that's just what I think personally. A really good video that covers the topic of Predator 2 being an underrated film in more detail is Predator 2 Underrated by Alien Theory? If you're interested, I definitely recommend it as he does a really deep dive into it and it's a very interesting watch. Predator 2 trades the jungles of Guatemala for the city of Los Angeles, creating a whole new environment, giving the movie a very different tone and atmosphere to the first. Whether that's for the best or the worst ultimately comes down to the viewer. I think they made the right choice going for a different setting, as it differentiates it from the first movie and makes it feel distinct, like its own thing. It does retread some familiar ground with the basic premise, but thanks to the different setting it feels more like a continuation rather than a rehash, which I think it would have felt like if they'd have gone with a jungle backdrop again. It also features a cast of brand new characters. The main cast consists of Harrigan, a tough grizzled police detective who does his best to fight the city's drug crime and gang violence, but is a bit of a maverick and often butts heads with his superiors. At the beginning of the film, he catches the attention of the city hunter predator who sees him as his next prized trophy. Next, there's Danny and Leona, fellow detectives and members of Harrigan's team. Then rounding out the cops is Lambert, played by Bill Paxton, who you'll probably recognise as Hudson from Aliens. He was the standout for me, as I thought his character was very funny.
So I go in for my physical, right? And the doctor says, I need a semen, stool, and urine sample. I say, gee, doc, I'm in a big hurry. Can I just leave my underwear?
And then there's Keyes, who's the leader of the Otherworld Lifeforms Task Force, a government agency who have been investigating the Yautja species' existence since the events of Predator 1. He's kinda like the Dylan of this movie, as he's the big agency man who comes in and treads on the protagonist's toes, and is not quite a bad guy, but somewhat at odds with the main hero. There are quite a few parallels between the two, as they both keep the heroes in the dark and get on their bad side, and then both redeem themselves before being killed by the Predator. Though I don't feel the deaths of each character had quite the same impact as it did in the first film, I feel they were all much more fleshed out in Predator 1. In this movie, we are introduced to an entirely new Predator. He has a different design to the Predator of the first movie and is described by the filmmakers as younger and more flamboyant.
Is just full of the exaggerated swagger of a black teen.
While he is a different individual and has a different look, he is still the same species, retaining the same basic form and weapons we saw the Jungle Hunter using, but with the addition of a few new tools and gadgets as well. I like how they decided to go with a new design. I think something we all as Predator fans enjoy is the different character designs, making each one feel like a unique individual. While the original is my favourite, I don't want every Predator to look the same. The way the creators describe it in the behind the scenes featurette is how they drew inspiration from different types of snakes. Some have different colours and patterns, and some will have a different head structure than others, but they are all still snakes. And at the end, we also get a look at the other members of the City Hunters tribe. When I first watched it, I thought they all just looked the same as City Hunter except for the Elder, but on closer inspection they are all actually unique, a nice touch and a detail I appreciate. Seeing the extra Predator characters, weapons and their ship was a great way to expand the lore and mythology behind the Predator species. The special effects are a bit of a mixed bag, and due to there being more of them and the Predator being shown on screen a lot more this time around, it is more noticeable. A lot of the old optical effects are a little dated looking, especially nowadays if you're watching it in HD on a large TV. Something they mention a lot on the behind the scenes special feature is that they wanted to show the Predator more throughout the film, but I feel half of what made the first so great is the kind of Jaws shark effect it had, where not seeing the creature so much added tension to it. Here, also, I feel the quality of the Predator face wasn't as good as the first, especially in some of the very up close shots. The pacing of the film is not quite as good as the first, as where the first felt like we got the initial action scene, but then after we learn about the Predator, it's like a smooth curve upwards and it never skips a beat. Here, it's a bit more rocky and feels like it's picking up, then it slows down, then picks back up again, only to slow back down. In my review of Predator, I mentioned that I usually find films to have those few minutes where I'm a bit bored and then waiting for the next exciting part, and Predator 2 definitely has those. I also felt at the start it got into the action a bit too soon, and it was kinda like if in Predator 1 we never got the briefing scene and instead started at the attack on the compound. I think Harrigan was introduced fine, but I would have liked maybe a minute or two to introduce Leona and Danny a bit more, as I felt we hardly got to know them that well, especially Danny, who dies relatively early on. And we also see the Predator both through his vision and in its cloaked form within the first 5 minutes, which I felt was a little bit too soon. It does have some iconic and memorable scenes too, such as the apartment where he fights a bunch of the Jamaicans and the meat factory where he takes out the OWLF members, a pair of very fun and cool action scenes. Then there's the alleyway where he confronts King Willie. The build-up where he's walking through the puddle is really cool. And then at the end where we even get to see inside of the Predator ship with the trophy wall and the infamous alien skull. On the whole, it's a fun film. I found it enjoyable and would give it a recommend if you liked the first one. It may be inferior to the first in practically every way, some bits may be a bit dated or a bit cringe, but for what it is, it's a decent film. Not a classic perhaps, but definitely better than The Predator. A lot of people seem to have grown to like it over the years. To give it a score, I would give it a 7 out of 10. Thanks for watching my review of Predator 2, make sure to leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it to help me out with the algorithm. I'm currently reviewing all the Predator movies in the lead up to the release of Prey. I'm going in order of release, so next I'll be reviewing Alien vs Predator, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel with notifications turned on if you don't want to miss that. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.